Ben, of course, is author of Give Them an Argument, Logic for the Left. He's got a great new book out that he's working on called Canceling Comedians While the World Burns, which I've been enjoying reading drafts of. And you can check out his Patreon page. He teaches. And Ben is now officially, what are you, the co-host of Dead Pundit Society now?
Yep.
Fantassimo.
Yeah. You should come on soon and talk about Against the Web.
Be my absolute pleasure. Before we get to, we have a couple of different debunks. We're going to actually talk about a pretty masterful Joe Rogan performance. And then you had a collision with one of the most odious people in the history of the internet. Before we do that, it's Marx's birthday, guys, and I don't want to be too, I don't want to go over the top here, but it's obviously in the ether of this show. So does anybody, I don't know, an influential essay, a fragment, whenever you first read Marx, I don't know. Any reflections does anybody want to do on the guy's birthday?
Yeah.
He would have had an extremely brilliant and incredibly underproduced podcast.
Oh, I think Marx was quite sloppy. He would have been all over Twitter drama.
Totally.
I mean, most of his texts really all start out with a condemnation of some obscure writer here or there.
No, that was what Bhaskar pointed at. Bhaskar was like, a lot of the stuff that it is really intimidating, but you also just start to realize that it's like, oh, like that's just his version of like a Twitter subtweet.
Yeah, exactly.
Actually, I was just looking at this quote from Marx from a letter he wrote to Engels in 1863, where he's talking about his factional rival, Mikhail Bakunin. And he says, and I quote, "Bakunin has become a monster, a huge mass of flesh and fat, and is barely capable of walking anymore. To crown it all, he is sexually perverse and jealous of the 17-year-old Polish girl who married him in Siberia because of his martyrdom."
What?
That's good writing. I particularly like the body shaming, which we should bring back. Anything else?
But it does.
Go ahead. Any particular reflections you guys want to do on this, other than the fact that he would have been a messy motherfucker?
I remember the first time I read Marx was in a 18th century, a 19th century philosophy class. We did Hegel, Marx, and Nietzsche. Wow. And I read German Ideology. I remember reading it in the library. And this was like 2007, 2008, like first couple of years of college. So like right during the financial crisis. But I remember and then I remember the class period talking about it like as if sort of at that point it was still sort of like a dead language, Marxism. Like it was, I found it fascinating and found it very intuitive actually. But it didn't seem like it was like a language of power by any sense of imagination. And then now it's definitely out of those philosophers. He's the one who's dominated my life more than anything that I really was introduced to in college. So shout out Minnesota State University.
Minnesota State University. Ben, David?
Yeah, there's so much to say about Karl Marx. Not only was he, I think that I would just like to hit like two things. One would just be some suggestions of a couple like essays that I think are foundational, because I know a lot of people get lost because there's so much that Marx put out, and then people are very intimidated by Capital, for example. I really have been hitting on this a lot. I think people should spend the 30 minutes it takes to read the Communist Manifesto. There's a kind of feeling that some people have that it's so elementary that if you're already a socialist and you skipped it for whatever reason, that you don't need to go back. But it's a really important text that really comes and makes clear like the ideas of historical materialism and the kind of communist project and the mindset that he was putting forward. And a lot of really important work when it comes to class consciousness. Too, I also highly suggest the German Ideology, which is something that I've been sort of returning to more and more lately. Because that was a really crucial text in laying clear like the idea of ideology as a very important like political concept that we needed to break through, and for some of the more interesting writings on communism that Marx ever did, like explicit. And I just wanted to share this one line from the German ideology. Where Marx says, communism is for us not a state of affairs, which is to be established, an ideal to which reality will have to adjust itself. We call communism the real movement which abolishes the present state of things. The conditions of this movement result from the premises now in existence. And I think that really encapsulates the kind of Marxist materialist politics, which is completely separate from a kind of like idealist politics, right? That these are things that will come out of like these movements rather than something that will just be able to be imposed top down. And I think there's a lot of lessons and reflections that people really need to be doing, and returning to Marx is a very rewarding process.
Yeah, I guess I have three quick thoughts. One is to second the recommendation about the Communist Manifesto. I actually think about it a lot when in the context of certain kinds of like intra-left debates and disagreements about tactics and strategy, because it often occurs to me that like the last chapter of the Communist Manifesto, everybody knows the last couple lines, right?
Mm-hmm.
That, like, workers have nothing to lose but their chains, workers of the world unite. But nobody seems to read or remember what the actual chapter that's in is, right? So the actual chapter title is Position of the Communists in Relation to Various Existing Opposition Parties. And it's all about how under different concrete conditions you have to support and ally with tactically different existing movements that fall short of what you want, right? So, in Poland, we support the struggle for independence. In this place, we support, the bourgeois democratic opposition party, et cetera, et cetera. And I find it really striking because I think there are people who think of themselves as Marxists who sort of categorically reject the idea that that those kinds of tactical calculations, strategic compromises, whatever, would even come up, that would even be something you would have to do. The second point would be, as far as like what people can read that's short, you don't like, even in quarantine, you have a limited amount of time. You're not going to dive into all 3 volumes of Capital. One thing that I think is like really rewarding is you go to like Marxist.org, where all this stuff is free, and you go to the Critique of the Gotha Program and read just chapter 1 of the Critique of the Gotha Program, just on its own. It's like a 5-minute read, and I think it's really important and kind of underappreciated because the distinctions that he's laying out in there, if you wonder about things like, okay, so do socialists or Marxists, or in Marx's view, should socialists advocate absolute equality no matter what, or how should they think about that issue? Is sort of distribution what we should be thinking most about, or should we be thinking about ownership? All of that stuff Marx lays out in a very, in a way that's like very quick for you to read, and it's not really too abstract because he was writing it not for his own satisfaction. Like I think Marx has a line somewhere when he's talking about the German ideology, when he says that his and Engels' original plan was to write it to like work out their own thoughts and then leave it to the gnawing criticism of the rats. But like the Critique of the Gotha Program isn't like that. He's writing it for this immediate context for this factional struggle in the German socialist movement. So he's writing for people who are immersed in left politics but aren't necessarily philosophers or theoreticians. Final thought: I was often think about one of the best pieces of Marx's writing. Other than stuff like his body shaming of Bakunin, which is also, good writing in its own way, which was in his introduction to the critique of Hegel's philosophy of right. And, in context, he's talking about, his critique of religion. But I think it's just generally applicable to illusions and disillusionments of any kind, right? You could think of that in terms of the whole enterprise of debunking things, right? When he says that the purpose of trying to combat these illusions, what he refers to as plucking the flower from the chain, is not so that people can wear the chain without consolation, but so they can throw off the chain and pluck the living flower. And that's both very good writing and just very insightful.
Yeah, that's awesome. I'll just add quick. So I took Capital in college, and again, this was a very good class. It was very demanding. I was a Chomsky kid, very influenced by the kind of the anti-globalization movement, which I was peripherally involved in as a teenager. And, I was interested, in fact, I was interested in some Green Party formations. So I think a backdrop of a lot of my thinking was very much that, I would read some like Alexander Cockburn and sort of have some strategic understanding of the Soviet Union as a counterweight to America. And of course, like everybody, I had some interest in Cuba, but, it was very much of that time, which is that in the sort of big picture sense, communism is discredited. And from a liberatory standpoint, basically some version of sort of basically progressive liberal politics with some sort of anarchist flourish and varnish was kind of the best you could hope for. And then I also would say I felt so marginalized, frankly, by my upbringing that I was like terrified of getting involved in like some type of hopeless enterprise. And that played with my own psychology and various traumas that I won't get into, but I will say it's important for context. And when I read Marx and I went in, I understood. I mean, I had read some philosophy. I had some understanding of continental philosophy, not on any deep level, but I knew that Marx wasn't just a pamphleteer. I was certainly not ready for the level of economic rigor in it, and I was not ready for the scope. But I would say that really the biggest thing that hit me was just the idea of profit as stolen labor time, just to keep it really simple. That reframe of looking at a factory or looking, and then actually, because I wrote a piece that applied it to Silicon Valley and did well on that paper. And that, and it was great to look at like, hey, all of the new rhetoric of production and different types of work is being valorized. But if you accept this frame of what actually generates value and that basically wages conceal the true relationship between labor and value is mediated by a boss, I thought it unsettled me in my worldview. I mean, it wasn't just a sort of additional, I already came in obviously with a understanding of injustice and inequity and so on, but that's no different than the kind of utopians and people with various moral rejections. This was a alternative way of systemizing how the economy looks, and I thought that was pretty compelling. And then the other one, I was very interested in the African National Congress at the time, and of course I still am. And I wanted to do a piece kind of fitting this stuff with what I was learning about the liberation of South Africa and then the challenges going into governing South Africa. And so my professor guided me to one of these essays that it gets popped up with this sort of generic, like Marx is bad. But one of the most, I won't even attempt to summarize it, but on the Jewish question, it's one of the most demanding and rewarding things I've ever read in my life. And the distinction between political emancipation and human emancipation. And anyway, I would just say, to make a long story short, I actually think a lot of the real basic anchoring of my politics, which like everything else is in motion, but has gotten more and more anchored into this materialist base, actually does go back to reading that essay, seeing how I could correlate it with what was happening with South Africa, how you could achieve the most difficult, unimaginable liberations imaginable against the most entrenched, despicable forces, whether it be anti-Semitism, as he was writing about, or obviously the South African apartheid state, and that there was nothing but movement and motion in them. And then at the same time, you could completely leave other aspects of state and private relationships entirely unaltered. And in fact, not only unaltered, they could merge with the new forms. And again, it was just another one of those experiences of like, it was really frustrating and exhausting and unpleasant, but actually like, fuck, that's a different way of looking at things, and one that's quite compelling.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I never went to synagogue again. Definitely not the point of that essay. I was like, that's a real.
Yeah, I mean, I think actually we're talking about On the Jewish Question the first time I was ever on TMBS.
Yeah,
talking about how this is like really the way that people quote mine on the Jewish Question is really like one of the best signs of like how at least the internet like makes it, well, I'm not going to say makes us dumber, but makes it easier for us to be dumb, right? Because it used to be that if you wanted to quote mine something, you had to at least flip through it first, and you might accidentally get a general impression of what the book is about. Whereas now you can literally just search key phrases and find shocking sounding passages and quote that. So, if there's some stuff that, sounds anti-Semitic in there, if in fact, maybe there's some stuff that actually does reflect the fact that, Marx in certain respects, right, accepted, some of the ideas that were in the air about this stuff, even as he was critiquing others of them, right, that they, but then like you entirely miss the fact that not only is it not an anti-Semitic essay, the entire point of the essay is to criticize his fellow young Hegelian Bruno Bar who was making this bad kind of Hegelian argument against Jewish emancipation, and to argue that not only in favor of Jewish emancipation, right, not only in favor of giving Jews legal equality, but also to say that legal equality wasn't enough and we had to go beyond that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And also the dynamic, which again foreshadows so many other things of course, yes, like you can do a psychological read of it and say, what are his own ambiguities about his own Jewish heritage? In what extent is he absorbing prevalent anti-Semitic attitudes? Absolutely. But he's also, and this is also another beef he's having with the young Hegelians, he's also kind of juxtaposing the need for Jewish rights and actually questioning beyond. It's almost like three steps. I read it. It's like, okay, there's political rights for Jews. That's not enough because that doesn't encompass all of human emancipation. But then when we start to encompass all of human emancipation, maybe we want to liberate ourselves from religion generally. Mm-hmm. And that's part of the tension and contradiction of the essay. But that's not an apology for anti-Semitism. That's actually an attack on the young Hegelians, trying to basically saying that having a secular state liberates you from religion, which of course is an argument I love because the structures continue even as the clothing changes. But yeah.
Yeah. And I would just add in that, spirit of criticism too, that, people understand that, one of the reason Marx is so important for the socialist movement or the communist movement is not because he invented socialism or communism, which I think a lot of people think that is what happened. It was literally that, like, there were a lot of tendencies that were happening around Europe at that time that were about like a kind of some form of liberation for the working class. But, you know, a lot of them were very utopian. You had people who were like, we're going to go off into the woods and build like a magical, you know, society. Marx thought that was a ridiculous idea, obviously. And then there were people who were very fast and loose with their understandings of economics and like the generalized oppression under capitalism. So like what Marx's like greatest contribution, I think, to the socialist and communist movement was giving it a kind of, you know, academic scientific rigor in it. So it wasn't just like a kind of moral proclamation against the system, right? It's like plenty of people are frustrated with the system around them. But what becomes very powerful is when you start to understand the system around you so that you can change it. I mean, that's like, you know, Marx's famous quote, like the job of philosophers is not to understand the world, but to change it, right? And not merely to interpret the world, but to change it, right? That's like the real Marxist legacy for me, at least, is that was just like really building, like, you know, and not, by the way, pushing down your kind of moral anger or anything like that. If you read Marx, it's filled with like frustration and passion, but it was always, you know, as Lenin says, like, have your heart on fire and your heart on fire and your brain on ice, right? It's like you have to have both of those sides if you want to make changes in the world.
Yeah. Awesome. No, yeah, he came along and there were these big social disruptions happening, and there were some French guys that were just like, what if we drove a unicycle on a tennis court? Would that not be socialism? And Marx was just like, no. I'll still give Marx the nebbish voice. No, because it's not economics, god damn it. Hegel was smart, but he was an asshole. All right. And Feuerbach is a fucking poser. So the only reason people will remember his name was because I embarrassed him. He's the Memphis Bleak of his time. All right.
See, now
actually, that's not a bad analogy. What?
See, now you don't even have to read Marx. It's all
I got you. Basically, yeah. French politics, German philosophy, and English economics. None of these other idiots can do it because they're dumb. It's actually kind of true.
You just watched a Michael Brooks show video. Subscribe to get them all. Why wouldn't you? Don't be foolish. Click subscribe below and become a patron as well. Patreon.com/TMBS. Thanks, everybody.